Morning everyone, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Resolution Foundation this morning. We are discussing our Call of Duties report, which talks about tax options for the budget. First thing to say is we have a slight change to the panel, so I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Needle as planned, who's a tax lawyer, journalist and commentator. Caroline unfortunately is unwell, so we wish her well, and we're very grateful to David Willits, President of the Resolution Foundation, for joining the panel to help us with the discussion this morning. So look, why have we written a report about how you can raise tax? It's not because we like high taxes. Actually, low taxes are good for living standards, and we would like taxes to be as low as possible. But we do need to face the reality of the public finances right now. And really, when you step back over the last year, the government increased spending on public services. It then in the spending review gave 90% of that increase to the NHS. It now finds that, in fact, the public finances are, we expect, on a worse path than expected. So we do think the OBR will give the Chancellor a higher forecast for borrowing this autumn than they had before. Some of that is changes in policy. Some of it is a higher cost of borrowing that the UK is facing, and some of it is we expect a deteriorating economic outlook in the OBR's judgment. So all of that means that the choice faced at the end of the day is quite stark between the government's commitments to the NHS and the government's commitments on tax. And so we cannot see a world in which spending plays the major role in the budget this autumn. And that means that given the size of the gap could be in excess of 20 billion, the Chancellor looks like she will need to raise more than £20 billion in tax. So we thought we would put some ideas on the table. So let me start by asking Adam, Principal Economist at the Resolution Foundation, who's authored this report, to give us some overview of the proposals in it. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Ruth. Okay, so yes, this tax challenge can't really be ducked, but there needs to be some strategy about what tax options should be chosen, given that some tax rises are more harmful than others. We've got various principles that help guide us in this report, which has lots of options. We try to avoid any big shocks to inflation in the near term to help bring inflation down, so no big VAT rise next year, for example. And we try to avoid worsening the outlook for jobs and business investment, especially given what tax rises have happened over recent years. Obviously, the main point is to add to fiscal credibility, so there's no point relying on fiscal fictions that just meet the letter of the rules and not the spirit. And above all, we want to address problems in the existing tax system, of which there are many. So we try to take a kind of principled approach, improving the tax system for the long term, in line with things like the IFS Merley's review, which have set out detailed thinking on what the ideal tax system should look like. One side effect of that is that we protect employees as much as possible. That's not necessarily because of the Labour manifesto, but because they pay higher taxes than other income sources at the moment, as I'll show. And where possible, it would be good if tax policy could align with other government objectives, so not just on growth and jobs, but on things like improving the nation's health and achieving decarbonisation. So we set out proposals across 3 areas and objectives. The first objective is to try and remove arbitrary tax differences between different businesses, because those undermine competition and therefore productivity growth. A good starting point before raising any taxes is to look at who's not paying the taxes they already owe. It's a bit of a cop-out from me at the start, but there is a real problem of small business corporation tax gap, which has trebled since 2018 and now stands at £15 billion a year. So any measures to help with that are very welcome. There's also the problem of the VAT registration threshold, which is very high in the UK, around twice the rich country average. And we know that leads to lots of businesses trying to stay just below it. with hundreds of millions of pounds a year of lost turnover as a result. But it's not just about small businesses. One big problem in the tax system is that we have employer nicks on wages, but not on other forms of income, including partnership income. That leads to a strange situation where big law firms, for example, high-earning partners won't attract employer nicks, but the receptionists in the building will, and we've just had an employer nicks tax rise this year. So we think that extending some employer nicks to at least some partnerships would be a good step. And finally here, another big problem with employer nicks is that it doesn't apply to employer pension contributions. This is a very big pension tax relief, over £20 billion a year by 2029. Given that we've just had the big employer NI rise, we don't think a massive business tax rise here would be a good idea at this budget, but it is a good direction for the tax system in the long term that this employer pension contribution relief should be reduced. And a good starting point would be to look at salary sacrifice, where a little bit of money could be raised. But given the possible sums that are needed, we don't think that business tax options should try to account for the majority of that, given the employer nicks rise. Obviously, the big part of the tax system is personal taxes, where it's easier to raise large sums. And our principle here is to try and reduce differences between different forms of income. I won't go into every part of this chart, but Jeremy Hunt was right to argue that workers face an unfair double tax compared to other people and other forms of income, maybe even a triple tax. You pay employer nicks on wages, which reduces pay, then you pay income tax, and then you pay employee national insurance, whereas for self-employed, for example, don't pay employer nicks, and landlords, for example, just pay income tax. So it's a good principle that we should try to move towards more consistent taxation. That would be fairer for employees, but also have economic benefits. It's not good to distort the choice of how work is set up or about what investments people make due to different tax treatments of different returns. There's various options in the report for making progress towards that goal, but a key one is what we call a tax switch. So this is firstly just a straight increase in income tax rates of 2p, so the basic rate, for example, would go from 20p to 22p, but at the same time you'd cut employee nicks rates by 2p. So for employees, those two cancel out. There'd be no tax rise for them, but you'd still raise around £6 billion a year, and this would be a step on the way to a possible long-term goal of abolishing employee nicks, kind of in keeping with the previous government's vision towards the end as well. But people other than employees would lose out. Three main groups are landlords, and here's what I found when I searched for angry landlord. The self-employed, which has been a long-standing problem in the tax system. It'd be good to narrow that tax difference between employment and self-employment, especially given the government's broader agenda on work. And we've just had a big tax cut in 2024 for the self-employed, a 3p rate cut and the abolition of the flat annual charge. So actually a 2p increase would just not even take us back to the rate in 2023. And the government's also talking about perhaps extending some benefits, extra benefits to the self-employed, so a form of unemployment insurance. So it might be a particularly good time to look at their tax treatment too. And thirdly, income tax going up would mean higher taxes for pensioners. This is obviously a hard thing to change at any point, but in theory at least, I don't think there's a great case for having much lower tax rates in retirement than in working age for a given income. So those proposals would move towards more consistency, moving towards the rates paid by employees, especially in the case of those partnerships. And we also look at raising the basic rate of dividend tax to help with this goal too. But it doesn't fill all of the gaps, and it's probably not realistic that a single fiscal event can move us to the ideal tax system. That's one reason why we also suggest extending the personal tax threshold freeze for another 2 years. So that's currently due to end in 2028, but would then end in 2030. That is a hit to employees and to living standards prospects a little bit, but we think that is a necessary trade-off at this point. But it should be said that that freeze doesn't have much of an impact towards the top of the income distribution in this chart, which is one reason why it's good to have some other measures for high-income households. And one other policy in that area is that there are some big holes in the capital gains tax system, which don't just offer low tax rates, but perhaps zero taxation. One big hole is the fact that you can move to Spain or any one of a number of other countries and not pay any CGT on gains that you've built up, which simply encourages wealthy entrepreneurs to leave the country at that point. And secondly, your other option is to hold on to your gains until death, at which point they will be written off from a point of view of CGT. And similarly, that encourages people to hold on to assets until death. So these are both very distortionary problems in the CGT system and very regressive ones that particularly benefit those with enormous business wealth. And we think that tackling both of those could perhaps raise about £4 billion a year. The third goal in our paper is to look at taxes on harms to help with those other government goals. Firstly, on the environment, an option is to broaden our system of carbon pricing. One oddity in the current system is that you pay a carbon price on flights within the UK and within Europe, but not on flights outside of Europe. And the UK has kind of agreed to tackle this alongside the EU as part of the agreement that happened in May. Obviously, a big part of the green agenda is the shift to EVs, which raises lots of questions about motoring taxes in the long term. There's a tricky balancing act here between trying to achieve that transition while also protecting tax revenue in the long term and designing a fairer system of EV taxation, which is currently very flat. You pay about £200 a year with very little variation. So I think a new vehicle excise duty regime could help a lot here. Lots of people have talked about linking car taxes more to weight, which I think is a good idea given greater impacts in terms of road damage, noise, and pollution from tyres and brakes, and extra space taken up as well. In the case of EVs, we also think there should be a link to miles driven, which is maybe the more controversial part, but would make a big deal to the fiscal finances in the long term. This kind of package, even if it just applied to cars sold in the future, could raise £2 billion in the near term, but tens of billions of pounds long term. Another measure which would help with fiscal credibility is obviously doing something about fuel duty. I don't think enough people understand that the fiscal forecast already assumes big increases in fuel duty. So the blue line here, the previous government scheduled, the rules at the moment are that there will be a 5p rise in March and RPI-linked increases every year as well. But obviously everyone's very sceptical that that's going to happen, so there's some potential here to improve the credibility of this part of the fiscal outlook. But there's definitely things that could be improved about the current setup. You get these big increases every April, and it might be that smoothing that path with quarterly changes and spreading out the 5p rise that's meant to happen in March over a longer period could be more realistic and would help bring down inflation over the next year. Obviously, it's possible that we might see no increases at all, in fuel duty over this Parliament, but the cost of doing that would be 5 billion by 2029 per year. So it would be a very big commitment for the government to make. And finally, the government should take up the idea of a sugar and salt tax, suggested by Henry Dimbleby in the National Food Strategy a few years ago. This would be a tax on food producers. I should say £8 per kilogram on salt, sorry. And potentially this would have quite big health benefits according to modelling that's being done for the salt component alone, maybe adding a month or two to everyone's life expectancy, which would be nice, while also raising £3.5 billion a year. Obviously we do need to be wary about the state of family finances and inflation at the moment. But it's probably something that wouldn't happen for several years, given the need to set it up and allow time for products to reformulate. And we also think that any money raised here should be spent on the child poverty strategy, especially getting rid of the two-child limit, so that would help offset any distributional concerns. So it's obviously going to be tricky, whatever happens, to raise tens of billions in tax, and there will inevitably be big losers and downsides, but we think it is possible that the government could also tackle the fiscal risks around motoring taxes to greatly improve credibility there, potentially even lower inflation over the next year, all while protecting workers especially, and not undermining business investment, making the tax system more efficient and providing a bit of a long-term tax strategy, especially in terms of NICS reform, and achieving some of those other benefits such as lower pollution, better roads and healthier food, and hopefully delivering a reasonable child poverty strategy at the same time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Adam. So look, there's obviously a lot of proposals in there, and we may not have time to dive into all of them, but we will try and pick up a discussion across them. I guess the thing I would add to what Adam said is they are organised in the report under a kind of series of objectives. One is about removing distortions between businesses, which we think is an area where there could also be growth benefits. In personal taxes is where we're saying we think, given where the economy is, the government will likely need to look to raise some more money, and there, as you've heard, we think it could be part of a longer term strategy to remove double taxation on work, or maybe triple, as Adam says. And then finally thinking about how we use the tax system to achieve other objectives, be that green objectives or health objectives. So there's a lot of proposals, but hopefully that helps you to organise them, and we would boldly suggest that the Chancellor does something similar and gives us a sense at this budget, not just of her specific proposals, but of her kind of tax strategy more generally, which would also reduce uncertainty as we go forward. But Dan, there's lots in there, so feel free to pick and choose the bits you want to agree with and disagree with. What did you think?
So it's pretty brave of the Resolution Foundation to have someone up who's not from the Resolution Foundation, and they have no idea whether I'm going to say this is excellent or terrible. Even more brave and perhaps foolish of a tax lawyer. The typical tax lawyer response to any tax policy proposal is to ignore the principles and just fixate on some small point of detail, which invalidates the whole thing. I'm going to do that on one point, but not on the rest. The biggest element here is something that I do strongly agree with, which is going a little bit further down the road of ending employee national insurance. I mean, there is clearly no reason for employee national insurance to exist. These taxes are highly convenient for politicians because they tend not to be noticed. They've been put up over decades in pretty much every country in the world. I mean, the UK is in fact unusual for how small employer national insurance is. In most continental Europe, it's twice as big. The sole standout is Denmark. I'd love someone to do some research into how Denmark managed to stop its politicians from yielding to the irresistible urge to hike social security employer national insurance, but they did. Everywhere else has had them. And it would be a major win to eliminate them. eliminating employer national insurance is hard, but a good first step is to make sure it applies to everybody. That makes it easier to eliminate in due course. Employee national insurance, much easier to eliminate, and we have a model here of how you do it. You wind down employee national insurance, you wind up income tax. As proposed today, you raise £6 billion, give or take. An employee will be in exactly the same position they were. Self-employed pay more, pensioners pay more. I fear that is politically going to be a hard sell. I would go further, but also go less far. What I would do is I would put income tax up by, say, 2%. And, sorry, that's exactly it. So I would put income tax up by, say, 3%. I would drop employee national insurance by, say, 4%, with the aim of raising something like 9 billion, but for employees that would be a tax cut. I think that makes it easier to politically sell the idea that plumbers, the retired, are paying more tax, because you have winners and you have losers. I'm also quite keen to go further than just a 2p dent into employee national insurance. Ideally, I would end the whole thing, but I think it's probably wiser of Adam to have a staged approach. So yeah, I strongly agree with the main element here. Am I being over-mic'd? Can you guys hear me okay? It feels a bit echoey. Okay. I strongly agree with the main element here. I would just go further, but also do it perhaps in a way which is a tax cut. And it's a long time since anyone's had a tax cut. Another big element here is the tax on LLPs, employer national insurance and LLPs. Obviously, I should declare an interest. I was a member of an LLP. I was paid too much money, and none of that was subject to employer national insurance. That is really weird. Law firms can be forgiven for using LLPs because they've been in partnerships for many years. It's kind of natural. What's less natural is how, if you look at, say, the fund management industry, every single fund manager sets itself up as an LLP. That is not because they're full of the joy of being in partnership. It's because of employer national insurance. And that seems unjustifiable. It's also, can we pause a minute to feel sorry for bankers? How can it be right that a banker receiving £1 million bonus, there's 15% employer national insurance on that? A hedge fund manager receiving the same amount of money, there is not. What's the policy justification for that? I think there isn't one. Again, I'm going to criticise, this is my tax lawyer thing. Adam, there is a niggly point here, which is that not all law firms are LLPs. In fact, the richest law firm of all, Slaughter & May, is a general partnership. You are letting them off the hook. So I think it needs to be not just LLPs, it needs to be applying to partnerships in general. There is a difficult point around how you bridge the gap from a sole practitioner to a partnership, but possibly what you do is you have a de minimis allowance of, say, £100,000 to which the new rule doesn't apply to, so that small high street firms are unaffected. But again, I'm disappointed to say it's a proposal I strongly agree with. It's a proposal that will raise far more lobbying, and there will be far more anger in the House of Commons than anything else on this list, because you are impacting lawyers, and that is inevitable. What do I disagree with most strongly? I think I disagree most strongly with the proposal that we equalise the VAT treatment of charging. So right now, I have an electric car, I have a charger at home, VAT on the electricity is 5%. If I go out to a public charger, or if I'm not lucky enough to have my own charger and have to go to a public charger, VAT is 20%. That is wrong, that is distortionary, says Adam, and I agree. But all the evidence suggests that if we cut the VAT on that, then the winnings will be kept by the suppliers. It's been extensively studied across dozens of VAT changes in over 20 countries. And if you have a VAT change which is small in comparison with overall consumer spend, as this would be, it's the supplier who keeps the benefit. Now, this makes economists very angry. They say that cannot be right. Surely it should be surely it should be outcompeted. And in the very long term, beyond the point that these studies are able to look at, they might be right. But the evidence is super clear that in the short to medium term, little or nothing is passed to consumers. We at Tax Policy Associates studied this for the nice scientific experiment that was given to us when the tampon tax was abolished and when VAT on e-books was abolished. You can look at the CPI data and see no change in consumer pricing. For e-books, it's even more dramatic because you can plot the price of individual e-books on Amazon and you can see the lack of change per book as well as across the economy as a whole. So I can't say strongly enough that I disagree with that proposal. If we want to incentivise charging, we should be looking at other measures. We should be looking at further subsidies. We should be looking at planning changes that enable people to have charges outside their homes, either routing it under a pavement or for above. And I think that would be more fruitful. So I disagree with that, but disappointingly, I agree with almost everything else here. Please do better to annoy me next time, Adam.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Sorry, I should talk about exit taxes. I didn't talk about exit taxes.
Do you want to?
Let me quickly talk about exit tax. So I think we're not calling them exit taxes today. We're calling them
A settling charge.
A settling charge.
Settling up charge. Sounds nice.
So it's a mystery to me why any entrepreneur in this country pays any capital gains tax at all. Because it is the easiest thing in the world to move to Spain or Italy, take your gain there, and you're done. I mean, it used to be even easier. You used to be able to go to Spain for a year and then come straight back. You can't do that anymore. But still, it's a remarkable hole in our system which other countries do not have. The slight danger is that the first rule of exit taxes is don't talk about exit taxes. Because if the papers were full tomorrow of government will introduce exit taxes, you will see a lot of exits. That reduces the revenue from an exit tax. It also becomes just a complete lose-lose if there ends up not being an exit tax. So exit taxes have to be done with care. They also need to be one half of an overall fair proposal. So the symmetric unfairness of exit taxes is if a Spanish entrepreneur moves to the UK and then sells their company the next day, the UK taxes them on all of their historic gain. That's crazy. Not just entrepreneurs, it's crazy for anyone of means who arrives here with existing investments. It's basic fairness. The UK should have the right to tax the gains you make when you're here. It shouldn't tax gains that you made abroad, and it should tax gains that you make here, but then dispose of when you're abroad.
See, I thought you hadn't talked about exit taxes because you told me not to talk about exit taxes, but it turns out you
We're not talking about exit taxes. We're talking about
settling up charge.
A settling up charge. Yeah, it needs to be done carefully. The way it interacts with tax treaties needs to be thought about. The way that you avoid being too burdensome needs to be thought about. But given that pretty much every country in the world does this, including noted Socialist Republic of the United States, then why can't we?
Great, thank you very much, Dan. Loads there that we could get into, but let me give David a chance to come in. Thank you for standing in at short notice, David, but your reflections on how this perhaps fits in with the bigger picture of both kind of living standards and the tax journey we've seen through a number of budgets.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. And look, I do think that the tax switch that we are proposing today makes a lot of sense. There's been so many different attempts in different ways to align national insurance and income tax. You can either set about it by trying to broaden the base of national insurance and make it more and more like income tax. I remember the social care levy that Rishi Sunak and Boris introduced, which was going to be charged on pensioners as well as people of working age. We have argued before that you should extend national insurance to working pensioners who don't pay it. So that's one way to do it, trying to broaden NI. But I think what we are proposing today is much bolder and more straightforward. Increase income tax on so that all income pays more tax, but then offset the effect by the reduction for people of working age. And although people in work and employees, and although we're not getting into the exact linguistics of how you analyse Labour's manifesto pledge, you could argue that this does actually mean that there is no burden on working people. I think that the biggest political challenge, of course, will be pensioners. But our work at Resolution has shown very clearly that if you look at the last 10, 20 years, there's a clear pattern of pensioner incomes rising relative to the population of working age. A factor behind that has been the benefit system with the triple lock, so that the pensioner benefits since 2010 have gone up by £900 on top of inflation. And meanwhile, benefits for families with children have been cut by £1,400 below inflation. That has been the balance of benefit policy. And if that's the balance of benefit policy, it seemed reasonable then at least to recoup some of the costs of things like the triple lock through the tax proposal. The triple lock also, of course, as we know from recent work by the OBR, turning out to be far more expensive than forecast because of the ratchet effect of particular surges in inflation and earnings on one forecast going to be costing 22 billion by the end of this Parliament. And we have shown in previous resolution work that after housing costs, the median income of a pensioner household now exceeds the median income of a working age family. And if you look at the poorest, the lowest 20% of pensioners also enjoy higher incomes after housing costs than the lowest 20% of families. So this is an argument for fairness, taxing incomes, whatever the circumstances in which you gain them. And I think that is a very fair and effective principle on which to base income tax and then ease the burden on on employees, working age people.
Thanks, David. And maybe we should kick off where you ended, which is just to talk about this tax switch a little bit more and the impacts that would have for different groups. And I guess, David, you're right to mention the different trends in poverty, but I think what's importantly very different about this proposal compared to the debates, for example, around the winter fuel allowance is by definition, income tax only is paid by those above a certain income and is paid more by those with the highest incomes. And so even within pensioners would clearly be progressive. Adam, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on the impacts for pensioners or the self-employed and where that would leave things.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying it's obviously a significant income change. 2% tax rise might mean 1% of your gross income is lost to tax if you're a pensioner on £25,000, I think. But also that is offsettable by other things. So there's obviously lots of moving factors all the time, the triple lock going up each year, as you say. So it's not like it would be the biggest thing happening in a parliament. It would just be one factor, just slightly reducing income growth rather than a massive hit. And there are obviously options here to phase things in over time if needed, and think about small offsets. And as I said, I'm self-employed. It's a jump, but it's only a partial jump back towards where things were before the pre-election tax cuts. So I think it's not unreasonable there.
So on the self-employed, because there were cuts quite recently, this would leave self-employed tax rates overall at 28%, which would be still the lowest rate in decades apart from the last 2 years. So I think it is important to take that step back. And then, as Adam says, on pensions, just to put some of this in perspective, a middle-income single pensioner would pay about £160 more a year as a result of a 2% income tax rise. That is slightly over a sort of 1% on the triple lock, and we already know that the triple lock is going up quite significantly next year and above expectations. So we have to kind of balance all of these things and trade them off. David, do you think the sort of politics of taking on pensioners is survivable?
Well, I think that the trouble is, of course, we are facing a significant budgetary pressure, 20 billion to 40 billion. You have to do something. So whatever you do, you will have political problems. But my view is that a wider narrative which is in our in our proposed switch are, first of all, you are protecting people who are working and earning, and also that there is generational fairness, is a winnable argument. It was ineptly entered into with the winter fuel payment last year, and as you rightly say, Ruth, this is very different. But the evidence is that pensioners themselves worry about the circumstances of their children. And this is simply equalising their treatment so that it's closer to that of their children. It's not offering. So I do think that this is winnable and has high arguments of principle in its favour.
And Dan, you were saying, I guess, implicitly that you thought it was a tough sell because you were proposing kind of raising less revenue by including a kind of tax cut for working age employees at the same time.
I think it's a tax. I think it's a hard sell because there's a widespread view that we are overtaxed. Now, it's obviously true that the UK has higher tax percentage of GDP than at any time in the recent past. It's also true that the median worker pays less tax than at almost any time in the recent past, meaning possibly less tax than any time since the 1920s. That is believed by approximately no people outside the policy wonk circuit. No one believes it. Everyone thinks the average person is paying more tax. In that climate, any tax increase is a difficult sell, which is why I would put some sugar on it. But my political instincts are highly unreliable, and you probably shouldn't pay too much attention to what I'm saying.
And we want to tax the
and
sugar.
We're going to tax your sugar, yeah, exactly. Can I ask you, Dan, about the kind of one of the proposals you didn't react to, which is this lowering of the VAT threshold, which I also think would be quite controversial because it does involve smaller businesses having extra administration and in some cases extra tax, but the kind of evidence as far as we see it that this is acting as a constraint on companies growing is quite strong. So I was interested to hear what you thought of that one.
In these discussions, I normally would have with me the chart of doom, but I don't have it with me today, which plots the turnover levels for small businesses and the number of businesses at that level of turnover. And of course, in an ideal world, you'd expect to have lots of micro companies, a small number of large companies, and a nice smooth curve. Actually, that's the wrong way around for you guys. A nice smooth curve dropping down from one to the other. But what we actually see, and many of you will know this, is a nice smooth curve and then the VAT threshold and a bump up as companies deliberately hold their turnover above that threshold, and then a precipitous cliff edge drop afterwards. And there's been a significant amount of research on this. I initially assumed that this was VAT evasion, that companies were simply not booking cash that would hit them over the threshold, and that happens a bit. But mostly that's not what's happening. What happens is that electricians don't take on an apprentice, because that would increase their turnover, send them over the level. Hairdressers operate as independent self-contractors within a hairdressing shop. Plumbers go on holiday in February to avoid hitting the threshold. And if you speak to small business representative organisations, they'll tell you you can't touch the threshold, it will harm small businesses. But if you actually talk to small businesses, you'll see the problem they face is not being 20% more expensive, it's being 20% more expensive than their competitor who isn't. And that's why we have that hump in the curve of doom, and we calculated there's something like 40,000 businesses in that hump. Now, some of those businesses would be growing and becoming sizable businesses. Someone somewhere, maybe you, Adam, should be looking at the long-term macroeconomic effect of creating a powerful incentive on small businesses not to grow. But that's what we have. So yes, cutting the threshold is important. Exactly how important, I don't know. In an ideal world, you'd cut it to a point comparable with the rest of Europe, where essentially anyone beyond a hobby business is registered. If you cut it a bit, then you are vulnerable to the correct accusation that you're making more businesses uncompetitive to their neighbour next door. The only real solution is to cut it right down to £30,000. That may not be politically achievable, but any cut is a good idea, and government should stay the course. And they should ignore these small business representative organisations who don't really understand this point and speak directly to small businesses who absolutely do understand it's about fair competition and a level playing field. We should probably also not forget that that is not the only anti-growth cliff edge in the tax system. We have another anti-growth cliff edge in the income tax system at the point that child benefit clawback comes in at £60,000. And we have an even worse clawback at £100,000 where the personal allowance clawback kicks in and the child benefit clawback. You can be, sorry, not child benefit, the childcare subsidy clawback. So you can in London benefit from perhaps £20,000 of childcare subsidies if you have two small children. The second you earn £100,000, bam, all gone. What marginal rate of tax is that? And the answer is there isn't a marginal rate, it's 20,000% or infinite percent or some ridiculous number. And that is actively stopping people taking their small business past the 60 and the £100,000 point. We're now outside the realm of the Resolution Foundation, the income levels the Resolution Foundation focuses on. But what is the macroeconomic consequence of holding people's businesses below these levels? We know there's a consequence in the NHS because I get calls from hospital managers saying they cannot persuade junior consultants to work 5 days a week as opposed to 4 because it costs those consultants more to work 5 days a week. They lose take-home pay by working another day. That's a mad way for a tax system to operate.
And I think it is also worth saying we have set ourselves quite a specific exam question for this paper, which is, we think the Chancellor faces a hole. What should she do to raise money? So the exam question for this paper is not what are all the problems with the tax system and how should we fix them? And so we've tried to contain it a little bit that way, so we don't necessarily disagree with Dan that there are lots of other issues that ideally the Chancellor would get to in time. I guess just
Just on that, but I am infuriated by the fact that for about the last 20 years we have seen zero tax reform from any chancellors. Tax is used to raise money, open the tap, or maybe to hand out freebies, close the tap. Year after year we get more and more cruft embedded in the tax system, a kludge here, a political compromise there. It's never removed. The tax system gets worse and worse over time. No one is stepping back and reforming, reducing the cliff edges, reducing the complexity, eliminating unnecessary taxes, having fresh looks at say, property taxation. And this needs to be done, but sooner or later a Chancellor has to think about tax reform. And if you can't do it in the hole this government's currently in, with the majority this government has, no one's going to do it. Sorry, that's a completely different subject.
No, that's fine. David, I wanted to ask about, I guess, returning to this kind of small business point, but broadening it a little bit. I guess the big picture judgment we've made in this report, amongst others, is if you think about the big levers of business tax, personal tax or consumption tax, and thinking about where the economy is now, we have essentially put the burden largely on personal tax in trying to fix the problem. You know, what's your take on that? Should we keep clobbering business instead? What do you think?
Well, as you say, there is this interesting phenomenon that we have ended up, for some people in the middle, with actually surprisingly low levels of tax compared with the wider media narrative. I completely agree with you on that, and Matt Whitaker has drawn this point out very clearly, for example.
And there's a chart in the report too.
Yeah, and it is something that we are very keen on here. More widely on business, I do think that the VAT measure is a pro-business measure.
Yeah.
We wish to see, part of the argument in our Economy 2030 report was we needed greater economic dynamism, business dynamism, companies growing, some companies shrinking, and we do think that the threshold where it currently is an impediment to that, for the small business sector. So I would argue that this ties in with our wider economic agenda as well.
And Dan, just before we move on, under our business section, we also had this get off lightly, just cut down some avoidance more, particularly with small businesses. You wanted to mention that?
Yeah, I mean, the usual rule is anyone who says you can raise lots of money by clamping down on avoidance and closing the tax gap, they're lying. They're misunderstanding the data, the money's not there. But there is a genuine mystery in what's been going on with the small business tax gap. How can it be the large business tax gap has reduced by 2/3 over the last 25 years? That's a great achievement by HMRC, but let's book it and ask how come over that same period the small business tax gap hasn't gone down, it's gone up 3 times. And this paper says that's costing 15 billion a year. I believe the total may actually be a little more than that. What's the reason for that? How come it's gone up 3 times? Anyone know? Nobody knows. I've spoken to HMRC, I've spoken to the Treasury, I've spoken to the people responsible for the tax gap calculations. Nobody knows why it is. It seems a small part may be methodological, but only a very small part. I think part of it may be an industrial level of tax avoidance and tax evasion taking place through what's called umbrella companies, which plug for tax policy associate websites. We've written a little about that. And that may be essentially misclassified as this, and it may be there's an anti-avoidance that could reduce it. But my God, working out where that 15 billion loss is should surely be right at the top of the priority list for the Chancellor.
Great. I think we should turn and talk a little bit about what's missing from this report, what's not in this report that people might have expected would be sources of revenue. So I wanted to put 2 to the panel. One, we've been asked about online, if we can bring the question up, which is, why are we not talking more about property taxes in this report? Council tax bans or a land tax? Should we talk more about that? And then the other one that I'm sure is on people's minds is a wealth tax. Proposals for a net wealth tax have been talked about quite a lot over the summer. These are obviously not completely disconnected, but would a wealth tax be, in fact, an easier way than some of our suggestions to raise money? Adam, do you want to say anything about why those haven't featured so prominently in our report?
Yeah, so I guess going back a little bit to what Dan was saying about reform, we definitely think that council tax needs complete overhaul and that stamp duty is a bad tax and should be cut as much as possible. But I'm sceptical that there's much money that can be raised at the budget in these areas, especially if you're trying to do big reform. It's easier to do that at a tax reducing event rather than trying to raise money at the same time. There's been discussion about proposals to try and move away from stamp duty, sort of spread that out and have people pay recurring taxes instead going forward. But that's actually a big tax cut in the short term, a big loss of revenue as people pay it later instead. So yeah, I just don't feel like that's on the cards at the moment when the challenge is raising substantial amounts. And I should say that council tax is obviously going up for everyone each year at quite a hefty rate at the moment. And the government has a fair funding review going on, which will do some redistribution across the country, perhaps require even larger increases in London, for example. So there are things happening. I think it's hard to throw in a really chunky revenue raiser here, given that these taxes are already quite small compared to personal taxes. You can maybe raise £1 billion, but trying to raise £10 billion is impossible, I think.
David, anything you wanted to add on property or wealth?
Yeah, I mean, there's this great debate about wealth tax at the moment. The fact is, we have no doomsday book, national register of people's wealth that we can tax. Setting aside arguments of principle, that it is just not feasible. The Treasury view, understandably, has always been that if you do it, you have to tax wealth when something happens in some asset where there is a transaction. Sometimes you can do that ineptly. Adam is right about stamp duty. There are other opportunities when you may be able to do more, and we are proposing some changes to CGT here. And although people react with shock, Ruth and I both have a previous Treasury history, mine much more ancient than Ruth's, but when I was Nigel Lawson's private secretary, he was proudly explaining why we had to have a capital gains tax rate of 40% to match the income tax rate that people paid. There was a time when Conservatives argued that capital tax, CGT rates should match income tax rates. So given what has happened to the value of assets relative to GDP, our proposals here are relatively modest.
Thanks, David. Anything you wanted to add on property or wealth, Dan?
I mean, capital gains tax is simultaneously too high and too low. So it's too low because it's pretty easy to convert labour income into capital income and so be paying tax at half the rate. Again, let's feel sorry for the bankers who pay marginal tax of over 50% on their bonuses. Private equity executives pay marginal tax of half that. Why? But the capital gains rate is also too high because if someone invested £1 million 10 years ago and today returns their investment makes 1.2 million, they've made a loss after inflation, but we tax that. So the effective rate they're paying actually ends up being over 100%. The answer's an easy one because it's the answer Nigel Lawson had. You equalise the rates, you have an allowance for inflation. A better idea is you have an allowance to reflect the normal rate of return. And Centax have done some fantastic work on this, showing that you can raise an absolute pile of revenue and equalise rates in that way. I mean, it raises so much revenue, in fact, I'd use some of the revenue to cut income tax. Again, I think it's how you buy public support for tax increases. So I would look.
Can we
seriously.
cut employee national insurance and income tax?
Yes,
Good.
great idea.
Very good, very
problem,
good. Very good.
Problem with employee national insurance is politicians put it up because they thought people didn't notice it and didn't see it as tax, and that kind of worked. Flip side is, when you cut it, people don't notice. We did some polling asking how many people realised they'd had a tax cut thanks to Hunt's cut in employee national insurance. 20% of people had noticed it. But if you ask people if there'd been a cut in income tax, 20% of people thought there'd been a cut in income tax. If you asked if there'd been a cut in stamp duty, 20% thought there'd been a cut in stamp duty. So unfortunately, my conclusion is nobody noticed the cut in employee national insurance. So this is difficult. Council tax, I think it's fairly likely they will put up council tax in the budget, add a couple of bands at the high end. Plug again, we have a interactive calculator on the Tax Policy Associates website, Tax Policy Associates website, that lets you play with various changes to council tax and property tax. And that will show that Adam is dead right, and the amount of money you raise from this is a few hundred million. Doesn't mean it's not worth doing. There's an equity case for it as well as a money case, but doesn't raise much. More dramatic changes, replacing business rates, council tax, stamp duty with a land value tax, I'm strongly in favour of. However, they are long-term solutions that are going to raise no money now. So I think it's correct they don't belong in this paper. But again, a government that's serious about pro-growth, pro-fairness tax changes should be looking at this. Ultimately, it's a scandal that the very large landowners pay so little tax, and so much of the UK is locked up in a small number of very large estates. If you want to deal with that, don't look at unworkable pie-in-the-sky wealth taxes, look at land value tax.
Great, thanks, Dan. Let me give people in the room a chance to ask a question. As people are thinking, oh, well, we could jump in straight away. Go on then. Lovely. Lady there.
Alice Jeffries from the CBI. On the bottom of your list of proposals, there was just quietly a mention of potentially putting employer nicks on salary sacrifice pension schemes. And nobody's commented on that. And the way that that was framed was as if there's this giant relief from employer national insurance in that form. Whereas if you talk about employer national insurance to most employers, they would say it is the biggest and most distortive bit of the personal tax system because it's the biggest proportion of the difference between self-employment and employment. And so another way of looking at it would be to say pension taxes, pension contributions are the one portion of income for employees that is not subject to a giant distortion. So my question for you guys is, why do you want to put more distortion into the tax system? It's particularly at a point where this government is looking at a pension commission that says that people are not saving enough into their pension, and we know that employers' response to last year's national insurance taxes was to look at cutting pay and headcount. So if you put national insurance on those pension contributions, you are potentially reducing the amount employers will put into their employees' pensions as well. Where is the benefit to that beyond the £1 billion that you think you're going to raise?
Great, thanks. I'll let Adam have a go at that in a minute. Can I check if there's a question here as well? And we'll take a few. Do you want to do that one and that one? Just while you're there, Molly, sorry, here.
I was going to ask on the whole partnerships thing. At what point do you think that you just end up encouraging those businesses to incorporate and move into corporation tax, where obviously you can start to shift economic profits into future capital gains, etc.? will it actually end up raising any money? I understand obviously the targets of it are not particularly sympathetic, but will it actually work?
I can answer that.
Great, thanks. Well, Dan will pick that one up for us in a second, and we'll take one more at the front.
Hello, thank you. Caitlin Russell from Embassy of Japan. My question is on the sugar and salt tax. Since the focus of the Resolution Foundation is on living standards, is there not a worry that that would be quite a regressive tax, even though you said that it can be offset by greater spending on child poverty strategy? What are the kind of numbers and details behind that? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I was conscious we hadn't talked about the sugar tax, so I'm glad we got a question on it. Adam, do you want to have a go at explaining salary sacrifice?
Maybe. But I definitely agree with some of those arguments about why we shouldn't whack up employer national insurance as a whole, given what's happened and given that lots of groups don't pay that tax. So we were sensitive to that in the report, which is why we chose a relatively small option. But I do think it's not ideal that we have different tax treatments for different parts of the pension tax system. It leads to big differences between the tax treatment of employer contributions and employee contributions, and it means that different businesses and different workers are essentially paying different taxes almost at random. And salary sacrifice kind of makes that even worse. It depends on whether your particular employer has been able to set up a scheme that particularly excludes small businesses where it's more of an administrative cost, and the very lowest paid are not able to take advantage of salary sacrifice due to minimum wage rules. So I don't think it's an ideal part of the system, and I think it would be good to move in the direction of reducing that difference between different parts of different kinds of pension contribution and wages as a whole, while being mindful of also the gaps with self-employment and other things, which is why it's important that it's part of a package as we've set out.
Thanks, Adam. Dan, you were going to help us on partnerships.
So why can't they simply convert to companies and get a better result? 3 reasons. First reason is for the big law firms, if you're going to have American lawyers in your firm, you cannot have a company as your law firm. US bar rules don't permit it. Second reason is for other people, if they could get a decent result like that, they'd be doing it already. So can you get a somewhat more tax efficient result than a partnership with employer NICs by incorporating? Yes, but it will pay more tax than at present. And the third answer is, the only reason you can get a somewhat better result is because of the lower rate of tax on capital gains. So that needs to be fixed.
And I think in general it's a feature that they could become companies instead, and we'd be removing a distortion that stops them from doing that at the moment, especially because there are reasons why it's perhaps easier for companies to make big investments rather than LLPs. So we should get rid of the existing discouragement to become a company.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that if you're structured as an LLP, there is a positive disincentive on you to invest, because if you receive profit and then invest it, you as a member of the LLP are taxed on the profit as it's made. You pay dry tax. So they tend to underinvest historically, which is a problem.
And then on sugar, look, we absolutely thought very carefully as a think tank that is focused on living standards and focused on low and middle income families, on whether particularly at this moment we could contemplate something that would have an impact on the prices of unhealthy foods. We looked quite closely at the experience of the soft drink industry levy, and we have seen there both an opportunity for the government to raise some revenue and quite active reformulation of products in a way that would be quite beneficial for the nation's health, and actually particularly beneficial for perhaps the health of low and middle income families. So that is why we think it's not something that, I don't think it's ever something you could do very quickly, but even if it were, we don't think this is something you would introduce very quickly. We think it's something you could look to introduce in 2028 or something like that, particularly so we're past the peak in inflation and particularly food inflation, but also so that companies have time to plan, and if the right response is to reformulate the products, then that would be a good thing. And these duties, taxes obviously are designed to both raise revenue and to have an effect on behaviour, but I think through time we've seen that they can do both, and we had a question online about whether our costing takes account of that, which it absolutely does. As you say, given the distributional effect of a tax like that, we are very clear that this is not part of a general attempt to raise revenue, as most of ours are. It's not an accident that the one we've suggested raises £3.5 billion. That is the cost of removing the two-child limit. And so I think as a choice, that is one that we would suggest is worth making. I'm going to bring our poll up, and I will definitely come to a few more questions in the audience as well. So politics of tax rises is definitely hard. So we've not put some easy options on here, but we have talked about them. So we'll ask people to vote on which would be the least politically damaging tax rise. We've put on reversing the 2p employee national insurance cut, which we haven't talked about, but has been kind of speculated about early on in this government as, you know, perhaps the political wheeze here would be to say that the cuts to national insurance that Jeremy Hunt made just before the election were unsustainable, and therefore maybe there's a political advantage to just reversing them. Obviously, we are deliberately proposing ourselves something quite different today, because we think when you look at the disincentive to work from national insurance, actually in some senses we should double down on the Jeremy Hunt strategy, not reverse it, but we're asking a question about politics, so we've put that in here. We've then got the proposal which we've talked about, which we've made today, to switch 2p from employee national insurance to income tax. We've put a sugar and salt tax in, which we were just talking about. And then I've attempted to summarise many pages from Adam with more car taxes, which I should explain, since we haven't talked about, is a combination of how on earth could you get fuel duty on a path where it does rise somewhat. The proposals in the paper are for it to rise slower than is currently in the OBR forecast, but also more frequently, to try and see a way through what has been an impossible political conundrum, but also very significant reform to vehicle excise duty, because, as we all know, we have a looming problem as electric vehicles become the more and more dominant, that we're then not taxing congestion or other things. So please do have a vote on our poll. I'd be very interested to see the results. While people are doing that, let's take a few more questions. We have one at the front.
Thanks. Will Snell at the Fairness Foundation. Question on capital gains tax. Going back to Dan's point about the possibility of equalising rates with income tax and introducing an investment allowance alongside your renamed exit tax could raise 11 billion or so a year according to modelling. What was your rationale for not including that in the report?
Great, thanks, Will. We'll definitely pick that up. I'm conscious there's a few at the back that maybe we could take together.
Hi, thanks. Anna Leach from the Institute of Directors. Just a couple of questions. The tax increase on business that you've got in here is £7 billion. So I think the point that you're sort of trying to contain the impact on business investment, interested in why there isn't sort of an analysis of that point in here, given the profit hits. I think Dan's point about the exit tax or the settlement charge, however you want to position it, and how the UK should only tax gains made in the UK has implications, therefore, for the non-dom regime, which now taxes assets accumulated outside. So be interested in sort of perspective on that. And then finally, on the VAT threshold, I mean, obviously, I'm, as a business org representative, quite torn on this, because I sort of hate it, kind of want to abolish it entirely, but also recognise the impact that would have. So how would you sweeten that?
Great, thanks.
I can answer the last.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to let people take potluck since there's so many.
Quick question. If you equalise capital gains tax with income tax, and then for family businesses with particularly low base cost, if you have that and then you have the inheritance tax, you do get to a somewhat stifling level. So would the inheritance tax be sort of like, would there be like an offset so that's not sort of increased hugely?
So look, there's loads of questions there. CGT rate alignment, interaction between CGT and inheritance tax. Are we being too harsh on business, what would the impact on investment be? Non-dom regime and the VAT threshold. Dan, pick a few that you fancy, and then between Resolution Foundation, we'll pick up the rest.
I think most of them are Adams. I'll just take the VAT threshold point. I think it's important for it not to be seen as a tax rate on small business. So every pound raised by reducing the threshold, I would use to reduce the rate. That ends up having a slightly depressingly small impact on the rate. Possibly you can drop it to 19.5%. But I think it's a symbol. It's a statement that this is being done for growth reasons, not for revenue reasons.
So I can completely see that. I think we do have to kind of put all of this in the context of needing to raise a huge amount of revenue. And it is undoubtedly the case that making changes to the tax system that are positive for reform that also raise money is much, much harder than doing it in a revenue neutral way. But given where the public finances are, it's unlikely that we're going to have a budget in the near future where there is an opportunity to reform the tax system and give away lots of money to sweeten the deal. So I think we do have to accept some trade-offs, and that we will all have to kind of bear some of the cost of that. And so where they are good for growth, even if they raise revenue, I would try and suggest that we all get behind them, even if there isn't the money to sweeten the pill. Adam, there were loads of questions. Do you want to pick up a few and I can remind you of the others?
Just on the VAT threshold, one thing we didn't look at in the report, but I'm a bit interested in, is some countries have different VAT thresholds for different sectors. So especially one threshold for goods where turnover is higher and a lower one for services. So that kind of thing could be a way to limit the hit potentially. On the last question, there is a bit of an interaction, yes, between capital gains tax being written off at death, how to change that, and inheritance tax. And there's a little bit in the report on how you deal with that interaction. But the fact that we've got an inheritance tax in the UK doesn't mean that we should forgive CGT at death. They're really separate questions. And whatever your view about inheritance tax, the current system is just indefensible economically, I think. And the question about CGT rates, I actually totally agree that is the right direction, and we wrote about that before the 2024 autumn budget. But we felt that the government had come to a decision last year about what it was doing on rates. So there's a bit of an argument for not reopening that debate straight away. And secondly, that it's really important to fix those holes in the CGT system before you do anything else. There's no point raising rates if people can just leave the country or never realise their gains and sidestep the system completely.
David, I'm going to come to you for any reactions, and then we're going to wrap up because I know that we have to finish on time. David.
Yeah, just one general point here. Look, I think one of the biggest changes in the structure of the British economy over the last 20 years has been the rise in the value of assets and wealth relative to GDP, from 3 times wealth to 6 or 7 times wealth. And meanwhile, despite this surge in the value of capital assets, the proportion of GDP collected in taxes on capital has only risen a very modest amount. What we're trying to do here, there's a wider narrative. We think that we should, in those circumstances, when you need to raise money, be looking at extra taxes on capital. And the people that we want to protect above all are earners. So this is a package which does indeed collect tax in some extra ways on capital. But the ingenuity of the tax switch is that earners are protected. And I think we have got the balance wrong historically of taxing earning too much relative to these other sources of wealth. And this package corrects that.
So let's see the results of our poll. And Dan, before you're allowed to go, tell me what your answer would have been. Oh, wow. Yeah. My sugar tax is more popular than I thought.
Yeah.
What would my answer be? I am genuinely not sure. I think switching 2p from employee national insurance to income tax rationally should be the least politically damaging, but I fear it won't be.
David?
Yeah, I agree. I think we go for the sugar and salt tax, and the political ingenuity of the 2p switch rather than reversing the cut is you say to the Conservatives, not You don't get back into black hole territory having to reverse something else you did. You instead say, you're right, let's get rid of NI. This is the next step in doing so.
Adam, do you want to vote?
I'm kind of surprised by sugar and salt tax doing so well. I think that there are definitely some political risks there, maybe. And maybe just to speak up in defence of car taxes, I think the idea of more taxes on new, heavier cars especially might be plausible, especially if it's only for cars sold in future when existing drivers are protected. And I think everyone can see the problems with cars getting bigger and bigger and the harms that causes for other drivers.
Great. Well, listen, thanks so much to the panel. We've had 3 people from Resolution Foundation on the panel, and we made 3 of the multiple choice options Resolution Foundation options. So I'm really pleased that one of them has won, but I hope that you found the report interesting, and thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks, Ruth.